Mindbend. Non-ordinary and extraordinary states of consciousness for Mindbend Creative.
I was excited to have you in today in part because I wanted to show you some of my Yola Tango 7-inch collection.
I saw that sitting over there. That looks like James McNew sitting over there. Amazing.
I was super excited to present you.
So these are all gifts for me? Thank you. No, I'm kidding. I know these are sacred items.
You could have a listening party at home if you need to check them out from my library. I had to sell most of my record collection during the pandemic, but I held on to all my 45s, which are some of the first things that I ever collected.
That's awesome. These are great.
And for anyone who doesn't know, Yola Tango is the primary score for your film Have a Good Trip.
Yeah, so I do have these two. I don't have these two. Love Yola Tango. They are in many ways, I mean, there's many bands that fill this role, but they're in many ways part of the soundtrack of our life, year in and year out. For years and years, they've been there. For me, for my family, for my wife and I. I got to know them through working at The Simpsons, crazily. It was one of these first things, and I guess this ties into the movie a little bit, which was realizing that there's like this two-way street between the comedy world and the music world.
Yeah.
And I was at the Troubadour in like 97 and had seen Yola Tango a bunch of times, big fan of theirs. And my wife and I were at a show. She wasn't my wife yet, my girlfriend at the time. And Ira and Georgia from Yola Tango were selling their own T-shirts. And she was like, you should go say hi. And I was like, no way, I would never bug. Those guys are huge. They don't want me bugging them. You know, and she's like, they're selling T-shirts. Yeah. They want you to come and buy a T-shirt. So I bought a T-shirt and we started talking. And then it came up that I was working at The Simpsons. They're like, holy shit, we love The Simpsons. And we started to have this bigger conversation. And then we got to be friends. They ended up playing at our wedding. So then we went to this next level where we were like, oh my God, you're really literally scoring the soundtrack of our lives here. We had them in an old, as I was telling you before we got on, I grew up on Nantucket Island, this little quaint whaling village island off the coast of Cape Cod.
Looks like the cover of Nothing Turned Itself Inside Out.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And we're not religious, but we got married in an old Unitarian church, which is this 1800s clock tower. And they have a beautiful old pipe organ. And we got Georgia up on this pipe organ, and James and Ira, and they played Ramones songs and Beach Boys and Yola Tango songs. And that was like one of those moments. But I would say the advice there, rather than just making that like a humble brag about how awesome our wedding was, which it was awesome, and I thank Yola Tango for that, but is if you have a good idea, that you're like, I would love that more than anything, go for it and try to make it happen, because then that's where the magic happens.
Okay, and that's a good segue to, you had a good idea to make a really fun film,
yes,
which took 11 years to create,
yes,
roughly from start to finish, called Have a Good Trip. It's on Netflix for anyone who hasn't seen it, and quite a process, huh?
Yeah, and I guess that's the thing also is like, I always tell my kids is like, go after the things that you love more than anything, because they might be around for years and years and years. So like, don't make stuff you're going to hate, because if it, it'll be sitting there waiting for you to finish it. This actually started to combine a few things we're talking about. On Nantucket Island at the Nantucket Film Festival, I was having a lunch. I've been on the board of the film festival there. I have a wonderful little film festival out there. I've been on the board for years, and was having a lunch with Ben Stiller, who happens to also be on the board. His family summered there when he was a kid, so he's also drawn there. So it's like this weird, like, oh, there's Ben Stiller also comes here. Okay, we'll have lunch. And Fisher Stevens, who had just made a movie called The Cove about fishing in Japan and the horror of the fishing industry.
And Fisher Stevens is Short Circuit, right?
And Fisher Stevens is Short Circuit, and I'm working on a documentary about representation, which is Fisher has a problematic a role. He did brownface in that role at a time where everyone white actors play everything, and so anyway, we don't need to go into that.
Yeah, last time I saw it was 1985.
Things morph and change over the years. But I was having this wonderful lunch with those guys, and as sometimes lunches do, we were going around the table talking about psychedelic like trips. Like, oh, I did mushrooms and this happened, I did this and whatever. And Ben told this hilarious story. And then Fisher told a hilarious story. And I was like, this feels like we should get a bunch of people to tell these hilarious stories, mainly leading with comedy. That's my background. Mm-hmm. And I can animate some of this stuff, because you can't really, how would you bring to life these psychedelic things that you can't just, build a studio and shoot. So that felt like a good combo. Fisher just made a doc, and I was like, how do you make a doc? And Ben was like, talk to my producing partners. Maybe we'll make this. And it kind of started there out of a casual lunch. And then, I started reaching out to people I knew at the time. Again, this is now 13 or 14 years ago when we started, was because it's been out for a couple years. People weren't talking about psychedelics. It felt like a very like touchy area to get someone to confess, like come out of the closet and say like, sure, I did acid. That sounded like, ooh, I don't know. You're never going to work at Disney again if you admit like this crazy, crazy thing. Now, the timing was really interesting because we ended up finishing the movie right about, it was about a month after Michael Pollan's book came out. And there started to be this bigger conversation about like, maybe these things are worth looking at again after 50 years of not talking about them. Yeah. And we had this nice movie where a bunch of celebrities were like, I'll talk about it. Here's something good that happened, something bad that happened, something, and we're like, oh, this is a big part of the conversation is destigmatizing, getting more people sharing experiences, good and bad, and different ways you can use it. What are mistakes you make? Like, it's not, the answer isn't just like, let's all do drugs, can call them drugs, medicine. But the answer isn't just take it and see what happens. There's a lot of work that goes in around this. So that was interesting to make a movie that started to explore that.
Yeah. Well, you riffed off of like narrative tools that have been used in the past to teach, like the more you know and the infomercial thing within the film, which I resonated really strongly for me because I grew up with all that stuff watching it on TV.
Yep.
And so you were aware that there was an element to even though you're setting out to make a fun and funny film, and most of the anecdotes from the film are humorous in nature, most of them. There was going to be an element of the film that was going to be part of the effort to sincerely destigmatize and to sincerely provoke like a productive conversation.
Yeah. Yes. And that sort of organically happened as we were making it. I went out initially going like, tell me a funny story so I can do a reenactment of it. That'll be funny. And then you start to have these conversations about what psychedelics do, and it gets much more interesting right away, And then it realized as we were making this movie that, And just to go off of what you were saying, also with the some of the stuff we produce, the more you knows, the more you trips, and these things, is I was really started to think about how I had been programmed to understand this stuff. I grew up in the '80s and a just say no culture and Ronald Reagan's America, and
it's programming. It was a concerted effort.
It was a concerted effort to really stigmatize this and scare you and go like, if you touch these drugs, you'll jump out a window, and also as growing up in that environment, knowing that was bullshit and seeing it in places like Grateful Dead shows where you're like, everyone is doing acid and they're fine. And they're also talking about interesting things and learning stuff, and then starting to read books about, by Timothy Leary or Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, Carlos Castaneda, and going like, or William Burroughs. I read a lot of that stuff in high school and was like, well, there's more to it than just say no. There's a much more interesting layer to all of this stuff that no one's talking about. Why is that? So I wanted to reference that in the movie as we were going, is go like, this stuff is easy to, fear is an easy thing for us all to lean into. Having nuanced conversations about stuff is harder. And comedy is usually a thing that gets you right into it. And you go like, oh, okay. One of the things that I love about this movie was my father-in-law, who's never done any drugs of any kind, psychedelics, never, wouldn't even consider them at this point, but watched the movie and was like, oh yeah, when Sting was talking about it as a medicine, I started to get, and I realized like, oh my God, like my father-in-law is not going to vote against psychedelic research and mental health use now. But he would have before he saw this. And Sting was a way for him to like lower the barrier. And I was like, well, that's hugely powerful for this entire revolution that we're in the middle of, and exploring the ways it can possibly help where we are. So that was a long-winded way of not
that's what
quite
we're here
answering.
For. No, we're here for the long-winded, seriously, because I feel like too often the information that we want to share is clipped up into short quips, and you kind of miss the overall holistic point. That's my hope anyway.
Yes,
so we have an hour to get long-winded, right?
Great.
So much I want to talk about, but let's touch on animation in particular, because animation is a core component of that film in particular. And I want to just keep you focused on have a good trip the whole time, but it's very pertinent to our conversation, and animation is trippy.
Yeah.
Like from my earliest memories, like some of the animation that I took in, like Ichabod Crane and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, like or the Garfield cartoon books I used to read. There was one that had all these bizarre scenarios of Garfield in alternate universes, and like animation just by nature can be trippy because it breaks the normal constraints of our three-dimensional existence, right?
Yeah.
Like, and heavy metal, and just, it pushes it, right? So were you fascinated by animation as a kid? Was there some meaningful animation in your life?
For sure, and heavy metal's a good reference. I mean, that was rock and roll and psychedelic and a little humor, you know. And it was like
Dark humor,
dark humor, but also this mix of like Blue Oyster Cult and Devo were part of the soundtrack. And I was like, as I don't know how old I was, probably 11 or something, going like, there's something here. What is this? And I subscribed to the magazine and would, you know, try to figure. I wasn't a huge sci-fi guy, but loved the animation. Yellow Submarine was really not pivotal, but you know, foundational for me. And just as far as like, you know, the Beatles were a big part of my DNA and growing up, and then Yellow Submarine was a way for a child to access the Beatles in a way that was like, oh yeah, they're like my friends, and I'm, you know,
there's something happening when you're watching Yellow Submarine too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of getting in you in a way that it feels trippy to watch.
It's a psychedelic message, which is ultimately like love, right? Which is often the thing that is just like, oh right, we're supposed to love each other. It solves everything.
Yeah.
It's like these simple things. But yes, Yellow Submarine was probably one of the first big things, which for me, and then. The way you could do the other thing that I love about animation is it usually lowers your guard for talking about uncomfortable things or taking you into spaces that people, because there's usually humor mixed with it.
Yeah, a puppet could do the same thing.
A puppet can do the same thing. It's I guess there's something interesting about, you know, it's human. Like what I love about The Simpsons and kind of learned there was just this thing of like, well, these are humans. These are clearly representations of us and our reality, and yet. They're different shapes. We can go inside their brain anytime we want. We can float around, you know, like anything can happen, which is sort of an absurd fungible version of our reality, which is like, oh, we're morphing a little bit to the left of what we're used to, and anything can happen. So which is. There is something psychedelic about that. Like when you take psychedelics, you go like, oh, right, that's just a reality we've created. There's actually a little bit to the left of that or to the right of that that is also happening. Like all of this is stuff we've created in our brains to understand it or make sense of it. So animation immediately puts your brain kind of in that headspace a little bit of like, right, this is reality, but not quite reality.
Yeah.
Like reality is bigger than what I see in front of me.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, comedy can help open that conversational door, right? By sort of tearing off the Band-Aid, and comedy with the humor of the animation, it's a pretty potent formula.
Yeah. No, I was amazed working at The Simpsons when we would just sort of casually do an episode about Catholicism or gun control or gay rights or something in the 90s. Yeah. And it would just go on the air and we'd get no notes and whatever. But if like Everybody Loves Raymond tried to do that episode, there'd be outrage or articles or, you know, like if a more traditional show was doing it, it's like, oh, because we hit them in these cartoons.
Yeah. So subversive.
So it gives you license to be subversive very quickly.
The Simpsons was monumental in my young experience of watching television with my family. Like when that show came on and we started watching it as a family, because I was raised in a Catholic household, I guess a pretty progressive, fairly progressive, open-minded Catholic household, but pretty devout nonetheless. And when we started gathering to watch that show on purpose, like there was like something profound going on there. Yeah. And it was in the zeitgeist at the time. I mean, what could you speak to that a little bit? Maybe like what was working, what got people so like into The Simpsons that
I think maybe it was one of the first shows like that was like, again, maybe because it was a cartoon that like a 4-year-old could go like, look at the colors and the fat guy falls down and enjoy it. And also your grandfather could be like, wow, that's a pretty scathing indictment of capitalism or whatever.
Right.
That there was operating on a lot of levels, you know? And so it made for good, I would say, engaged, smart families who aren't afraid of talking about issues after they've seen a show, you know, like great viewing for everyone. Cause all your neurons are firing on different levels and then you have something to come together and like, hey, we all enjoyed that. That was interesting. So and I think it was at a time, I mean, that was really coming out of the end of what we were just talking about, like this Reagan era of just sort of like, I think to the extent we can bend it back onto psychedelics is there was this moment in the late 60s where it was like, hey, psychedelics might help us solve some of this, what seems like the end of the world that's happening around us, right? In 68, 69, 70. And then there was a big pushback. Society was counterculture was literally like this phrase of like, you are counter to the culture we want to establish. And there's this huge pushback. And that became the Reagan years and this sort of like brand that was tied up with the just say no, et cetera. And then we got into the Bush years and that's when the Simpsons started, was like, oh, wait, now sort of subversive thought has been pushed away to like small punk gigs and stuff. And the Simpsons kind of came out and go like, well, let's find a safer way to criticize everything. We'll dress it up in a cartoon. We'll start making fun of this and that. And it's, like, remember, I don't know if I was watching it as a kid at the time. But when it was just like, I think George Bush was like, he had some phrase about like they're anti-family and the Simpsons is the sign, the end times there was like this big controversy about this cartoon that was like, but like, and then look at the last 20 years, like the Simpsons is fine. They didn't bring the downfall of civilization, which is where we got to with psychedelics. It's like, wait a minute, these don't have to mean the end of civilization. They could actually be a part of figuring out some of the stuff that we were literally trying to deal with in the 60s and then didn't deal with for 50 years.
What are you hearing about now? Just living, you live in Los Angeles, right?
Yes.
What are you hearing peers and colleagues talking about when the Michael Pollan book comes out, when the Netflix series comes out, when Newsweek has psilocybin mushrooms on the cover? What's the scuttlebutt? What are you hearing around your community?
Yeah, there's sort of two things happening right now. Like that, I think there's a model that was built with the cannabis industry that I think a lot of people are just putting on top of this and going like, okay, psychedelics industry, this could be a $600 billion industry. And that could mean a lot of things. That could mean marketing chocolates. That could mean, owning patents to drugs. Like there's a whole bunch of sort of business happening, which attracts a very crazy mix of capitalists. And then there's a mental health crisis and a planetary crisis that I think we're all like aware of and looking for solutions to. And that psychedelics maybe are a part of solving some of those things. And there's a lot of people working in that space that are also suddenly getting a platform, getting a little bit more like, oh, wait a minute, maybe some traditional ways of healing and traditional ways of talking about mental health are possible, are worth investigating. So
traditional ways?
Well, I would say like indigenous, like psychedelics have been used for centuries and centuries and centuries. Ancient technology, yeah. And it's sort of like, wait, why did we ignore these, or why have we whatever? So there's sort of two things happening, which is one that I would say I'm very pro, which is finding sensible, rational ways to explore mental health, positive ways to use this in safe ways to explore our mental health crisis. And then one that I'm very much, a lot of companies have thrown their decks at us because they're like, all the celebrities, psychedelics, boom. And so we've been just getting these decks of stuff that happen to have psychedelics attached to them in some way, that some are interesting, some are like, wow, that feels like a money grab. And it gets real weird, like any business, like that there's a lot of stuff. So to answer your question, what's the scuttlebutt? There's a ton of shit happening. That's probably the good news. For 50 years, there was almost nothing happening. It was either in dark corners of civilization or very rarely, like the FDA would approve research at a certain place, and the good news is there's a lot of stuff happening in this area that I think there's a lot of powerful information for us to explore. I think one thing that happened over the course of making the movie, it was interesting because, like I said, I started thinking, oh, this will be a comedy. Then I started talking. Sting was really an important interview for me to do. Yeah, because he was
more contemplative about the topic, and
he was like light years ahead of me on being able to explain and put this into words of like. Yeah. just simple things. If you think about it as a medicine instead of a drug, it changes the way your fear levels. And you go like, oh, right, I don't just like take a bunch of medicine and go party. Like that it immediately changes the way you start to understand it, you know? But as Sting started to talk about it, and as I started to realize like, oh, this movie is actually a lot more than just funny stories. These funny stories actually are helping build a conversation that is got a lot of nuance in it. There's not like, yes, everyone should do psychedelics, or no, no one should do psychedelics. There's actually a bunch of space in between because human brains are so complicated and different and need different things, and society changes and needs different things at different times. Yeah. Also, a really interesting thing that was happening to me as this 11 years happened, my 5-year-old daughter was getting a year older. I had a son born in the middle of this, and he was getting older, and I was like, what do I want to put out a movie that just says psychedelics, crazy, go do whatever, you know, and like funny stories from celebrities. And it was like, oh no, I would love for her to have the thing I didn't have. I had our scare tactics in movies that we were making fun of with the stuff we shot, our after school special and stuff. I would rather have a nuanced touchstone view and go like Ben Stiller took acid once and went like, never again. It's not for me. It was a nightmare. My brain is not right for that. But other people in the movie had transformational, really powerful, like, you know, revelations that changed their life. You know, and also talked about like, I don't do it every day. I don't use it now. I had this experience. You know, so it started to feel like, oh, we have a little responsibility within this movie to present a bunch of sides and information, and not Carrie Fisher said it nicely, which was just like, don't do it cavalierly. You know, do the work, do the research, read the books, watch the movies, you know, and here's a fun movie to watch before you even start to think about it, you know?
Yeah, and that's a good segue into, I wanted to get back to touching on the mental health aspect, because in the film, you do have extensive interviews or excerpts from interviews with Carrie Fisher and Anthony Bourdain in particular, you know, and the mental health component of their lives is something that's been discussed to some extent, and it's not really touched on in this film in particular. Carrie to more of an extent. I don't know when you spoke to Anthony Bourdain, but mental health and medicine, it's a big part of this. I think what you said is really important to stress, because I've been to conferences and conventions where we're talking about a lot of progress that's needed on the mental health front. We talk about a mental health crisis. Mm-hmm. I think some of that's verbiage to sort of encourage like legislation to move along and venture capital to come flowing in, right? But the reality is pretty sticky, and it's pretty real. And the idea of getting done with the conference and then going to party on the medicine always seems cognitively dissonant to me. Like, so I'm a pretty wet blanket though, because I tend to get like sappily reverent about a number of things.
Please.
And I'm sober too. So
yeah.
But Anthony Bourdain and Carrie Fisher, like mental health factored into their lives. Can you speak to the relationship that knowledge played to releasing the film, making the film, and anything that's transpired afterwards?
Yeah, no, and we had a long debate about whether to include them. You know, they passed away within, I don't remember all the dates, but it was within a year of our releasing it, and we were like, we had 50 other interviews, by the way, with amazing people that we eventually decided we have to just focus on. We got to pick 20 and just make, there's not enough time in this one movie, but like, for me, I love Devo, by the way, I mentioned earlier, but interviewed those guys. They have amazing stories and about how psychedelic, they're not somebody you think of as a psychedelic band, but then you go like, oh yeah, they're so psychedelic.
Yeah.
And
why would you not think that?
The theory of devolution and everything. Anyway, we had a lot of debate because we were like, we got plenty of material. We don't have to include them. But also, to me, both of them were dealing with different addictions and different kinds of depression, which are, you know, I have versions of my own life that I've dealt with. My mom had a lot of depression. You know, part of me thinks back and is like, if there was sane psychedelic therapies for her back when I was 8 years old, would that have changed everything? Maybe. That might have been really positive for her in a controlled setting with the right kind of therapist. I mean, she worked on a lot of different kinds of therapy. She also She also got sober. But I guess the big thing, sorry, I don't mean to sidetrack, but the big thing to me was I don't think Anthony Bourdain or Carrie Fisher in our movie was talking about psychedelics as something that they were addicted to, and in a weird way, they were like poster children for going like, that was not the thing that I got. That was Carrie, I think, says it in the movie, is like, that was not the demon I had to deal with. Whereas she very clearly was like, I don't want to say what drugs, because I'm not sure exactly for her, but and I think Anthony Bourdain has spoke very openly about heroin being like this crushing, awful thing for him, and alcoholism, and Carrie also dealt with a lot of those. Psychedelics were not those things. I think both of them were like speaking fondly about psychedelics, not using them currently, but going like, psychedelics were a big part of the way I saw the world.
Yeah.
And both of them saw the world in a really interesting way and explored it and shared from their art really amazing stuff. So in that way, it was like, oh, it feels like the psychedelics are attached a little more in the way they're sharing it. I'll let them speak, in the movie, but they were sharing it more as a positive for them. And so I kind of had to remove that from whatever negatives they dealt with in their life. That wasn't what our movie was about,
Sure, of course.
And that these were different drugs,
Yeah. I just was thinking that they are examples of people that might have benefited from a safe container to experience psychedelic administration in a therapeutic capacity.
Yes, and I guess that's why I was bringing up my mom too. That was what was making me think about that, was like, what if Anthony Bourdain for 10 years had been doing psychedelic treatments with somebody who could help him with some of the addictions, with some of the depression,
Yeah.
The way for myself that I sort of came out at it and to understand it in very layman's terms was just this thing of like, all of these things where psychedelics seem to be helping the most are boxes: depression, addiction, anxiety, the places where studies have shown it's the most effective. And what they do is when you're trapped in this box, they get you out of that box like that, and you can at least start to analyze that box. Whereas if you're trying to analyze depression when you're trapped in that box, it just takes a lot longer, And I thought that was, I was like, to me, that makes sense to me, of like, this is an accelerant for getting out of your what you're trapped in, done in a sane way with help, doing the work, integrating it afterwards, all that stuff. But
Have you discussed it
and
all?
Please, wet blanket, because it's interesting. I don't know.
It's my nature.
Yeah.
I can't help it.
I'm also sober. I've been, I think there is a connection with sobriety and AA anyway. With Bill took acid, and there's stories, it may be myths, but that like much of what the AA concept came out of the psychedelic awareness that he had.
Yeah.
And I think what that is, because my mom really benefited 40 plus years in AA, and downloaded it to me as a kid. That was like, I didn't get Catholicism, I got 12 steps, just like everything was about 12 steps. Yeah. So when I got to be 40 and was like, I think alcohol is going to be bad for ultimately like my demise. It was very easy for me to access these 12 steps. I was like, oh, we should all just know these. They should just be there if you need them, like without, anyway, I didn't mean to go into all that. But the point being, I think what is so cool about a lot of these 12 steps things is that they are, they're not for profit. They're about forming a community of people sharing trauma together, which is often this like, it's trite that we should have to be reminded that like, oh, if I share with other humans my experience, that I will feel better about my experience and they will feel better about their experience. We make each other better. And that's something you often is a switch you get from psychedelics, which is like, oh, right, I'm connected with other humans and also the planet.
How does that idea get succinctly expressed to people who can really contribute to making progress in this front? How does that very idea that you just said get synthesized into a way that can be downloaded into the arbiters of opportunity, right? Like what's the way to do that? I mean, I'm not really sure what the impediment is overall now. I don't speak to anybody who's regulating. I haven't had, I'd love to, I'd love to find out this. We're always kind of up against whatever their mentality is, right? And it seems like we have the mentality down here on the street, and then there's some kind of overarching mentality that's
really setting the groundwork for the rules, right? But that is just such a simple notion and so profound, though, and it's something that's so easily overlooked because it's not sexy and fast and glamorous and immediately gratifying. But like stressing the importance of, you know what happens when you share your experience with others, you know?
It lessens your trauma. Right? How do you do it? I think the way you do it, and this actually goes to what Mike Rosenstein, who produced the movie with me, what we've been talking about is we're starting something called Good Trip Studios, and with sort of that idea, which is how do you start to get everyone to understand the pros and cons and allow for this to grow? And I think the answer is stories. You need to go to people with stories that they will listen to. And that means not one story, that means lots of different stories. I think one of the mistakes that happened, no one's fault really, but like when we look at history, is like somewhere around 1970, Timothy Leary became the one spokesperson that was resonating in pop culture. And there were others, but not as big. And he was like, we should put it in the water and we should do this. And he was a really interesting, fucked up, fun, cool, interesting person, but he was easy to vilify. And, you know, if anyone's scared of that, there's one thing they have to disarm is Timothy Leary. I think the answer this time around, I feel like we're 50 years later, we have another chance to like explore what this could possibly do for us as a society, is we need 1,000 stories. We need 1,000,000 stories. Our movie was a version of that, which is like, here's 40 people talking about it rather than one person having an experience. You know, Michael Pollan's book is great. That is Michael Pollan's experience. He's going to resonate with a lot of people. In our movie, hopefully you can watch it and go like, I'm kind of a Sarah Silverman. I'm kind of a Sting. Yeah. I don't like what Ben's saying, but I do like what Reggie Watts is saying. Whatever. You have a bunch of access points to start to think about this. And I think the bigger thing is, I think what we're talking about with Good Trip Studios is, some people need their information in serious documentaries. Some need it through, veterans experience treating PTSD. Some need it through a cartoon about toads that people are trying to lick for their venom that's crazy and fun. And some need it through NFTs, and some need it through T-shirts. And there's a whole bunch of ways to deliver stories. Yeah. And psychedelics really lend themselves to bleeding across platforms. And we're like, let's do that. So that's what we're up to.
Yeah, and they just naturally produce stories.
And they naturally, yes. And force reflection and which goes back to your bigger question, how do we get people to sort of understand these simple truths?
Well, I think it's something that you could identify as one of the like endemic problems in culture is like, okay, the story is usually either force-fed to you or it's controlled by one like central power.
Yeah.
So maybe some of that's happening with storytelling that people are making of their own volition in the form of TikToks or Instagram Reels or whatever. Maybe that's storytelling. Maybe that's helping people feel empowered to share. I want to touch on one extremely wet blanket idea, and this one is sopping. I wonder about the risk of suicidality. I know that psychedelics are meant immediately, especially we hear about in ketamine clinics, like the immediate cessation of suicidality in a lot of instances. But there's something to me that they talk about like SSRIs. That's been a big thing for me because when I was 21, I had some trauma in high school that was substantial and fucked up and hard to process, and I'm sure that was a big part of what I started experiencing in my early 20s when I sought medical care for what I thought was becoming like a mood disorder without the language to really talk about it, right? And I was just immediately had SSRIs foisted on me and said, you're bipolar. 15 minutes in the counseling office at my university clinic, and you're bipolar. I was like, well, I have a friend's mom who's bipolar, and her life is shambles. Like, that's not my life, But I needed highly intelligent people to talk to, and voices to care, and good information. I didn't get that because that's not the world we live in.
Right.
I was force-fed Paxil. And I didn't stop drinking. I didn't stop doing other drugs. That drug changed to something else. I have no idea what the interactions were. And that's gone on forever. Like nobody gives a fuck when you're taking prescription antidepressants. They just keep rolling out the script. You know, they don't ever want to talk to you about coming off or considering what you're doing or whatever. So I have a serious axe to grind with that whole protocol. But one of the things they talk about is increased risk of suicidality, either when like you come off of medications or when you change medications or when you start taking a fucking antidepressant, like it can make you more suicidal.
Right.
So something I think about is when a person is having a psychedelic experience or multiple psychedelic experiences, and the veil between the existence that we commonly take for granted as what life is, whatever this constitutes, this experience is life, and something after, right? Going on a DMT experience and seeing the unified field and feeling pervasive love and knowing that, have you ever heard, it's just something I think about, could that potentially inspire someone to take their own life knowing that there's really, it's touched on in the film, like the idea, life and death, and they both work together, and it's kind of one thing, and it's not really anything to fear. And part of the psilocybin therapy for people who are terminally ill and is kind of getting that sort of feeling, right?
Right.
But I just wonder about, is that potentially something in people's minds when they worry about like who's getting access to the substance?
I mean, I guess I don't want this to sound flippant, but like, isn't anything potentially, isn't a powerful movie, for certain people? I guess.
I mean, something that can inspire you to question
whether
it matters where you're.
And I know we're talking about, something that is actually changing, can change your perspective very quickly and stuff. So I know it, but I would go back to, my take on it is don't do anything cavalierly. Don't jump anything. Do the work first. It's really about knowing your own brain, right? Like I'm sure all the things that you were fed and went through were an attempt. You're like hanging on, and like the world is barreling forward, and you're like, I guess I'll do this. And we never stop and go like, well, actually, how am I wired? I'm not wired like everyone else. We're all wired a little differently. What's going to be good and bad for me? Let me start reading about this stuff. Let me talk to, and like you said it, which is, it is hard to find professionals who understand anything, and especially understand your particular brain. So a lot of that responsibility is on you, right? Is to understand, like when I go to a doctor, even with what did I recently get? I had an ACL rebuilt, and I went into the doctor and he did all the Lakers and he's amazing and he's a nice guy, but I'm also very skeptical. I'm like, yeah, but for me, like, I don't need to play for the Lakers. So which version of this fits good? Now, he did rebuild my knee and I do play for the Lakers now. It's amazing.
Okay, good.
Great story. But I think it's the same with anything, which is just like, I don't particularly like horror movies, so I don't go to horror movies, I think when there's a whole bunch of different ways to do psychedelic therapy, I think there's a whole bunch of different ways that you might need psychedelic therapy. Finding it's like any therapy. Finding a therapist that you trust and want to work with is part of this. It's not just like, who's going to give me the drug so I can go try this out. It's finding someone to do work with and actually sit with and talk about how your brain is wired and start to understand that, and then understand if these are potentially something that can help you figure out whatever you're dealing with. They might not be. Like, I also encourage people to do the research and then go, it's okay to decide psychedelics are not for you, that it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. I think what you were talking about with Paxil and stuff is like, this is like one of those basic truths for me. What, like, I've been trying to talk to my kids is always just like, follow the money. What's the easy answer? Which is just like, oh yeah, if they prescribe you more, then the prescription just is more money. And so it just becomes this like, you're feeding a machine of profit and whatever. It's not about your treatment. No one was, but anyway, the quick version is, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, no, I think what continues to be captivating for me about working in this space is that people are talking.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's just like that in conferences I go to or meetings that I have and conversations like this, people are talking, and they're talking about mental health in particular.
Yeah.
It's not having a party.
Right.
It's like, it's not taking MDMA and going.
No, that's
and
the
dancing.
exciting part of what's happening right now. Is we're finally, like, there was a moment where the only place you could find this stuff was at a Grateful Dead show. Now that was great, and it became sort of this sacred thing that only existed in one place, and it's great. There was a place for it. but it was crazy that it was not used anywhere else besides dancing to music, and communing. I mean, that was whatever. That was a place for people to have a religious experience where they might not find one elsewhere, So that's cool, all good. But yes, what's exciting right now is we can actually talk about it in a very sane. The boring part is clinical, but it's a cool clinical to me, which is just right. We're gonna sit with plants and music and figure some shit out. That's amazing.
Well, the conversation about mental health in particular is important to me because I feel like I'm not so lonely when I know that it's going on. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so what do you think we're talking about when we talk about mental health? Is there an optimal level of wellness? Like, does everybody have the same experience of mental health? What can you even expect from your experience of mental health and fitness?
Yeah, and I don't really know. Look, I'm a comedy writer, producer, director. So for me, mental health has been like, write some more jokes and laugh about this shit because I don't know what's going to happen. So I am definitely not an expert in this area. Like all humans, I would say, I have had plenty of experiences with mental health, whether it's, through my family or myself or whatever, of dealing with shit, where you got to figure stuff out and the world feels like there's no answers, So I guess as far as optimal, like stuff, the people I've met who are finding this as a place where they never found a place before, like veterans dealing with PTSD. And then you really have a conversation with them. And then you start to realize like, oh, right, we never talk about what war means as a society. And yet we're always waging war. That's a weird disconnect that we don't ever deal with it. Oh, that causes some real like residual problems for people who actually have to live in these two worlds. That's fucked up. Oh, wow, now we have a thing that might help them figure that out. That's cool. Mm-hmm. That's amazing. So I guess optimal to me is like, that it's available for whoever it can benefit, and that people that it can benefit are given enough information where they're not doing it in a way that, like you were talking about, like that can lead to psychosis or like that can lead to mistakes, because this is powerful stuff. Not everyone should jump in a Ferrari or get on the SpaceX rocket. Yeah. It's like, so yeah, go slowly, find out if it works for you, find cool therapists who like you trust. There's so many different types of therapy and I'm meeting all of them right now. And some of them I go like, oh yeah, I don't want to do I would never do therapy with this person. And that's okay. That's me knowing what I like and whatever. And like,
Yeah, I don't talk to enough. I haven't surveyed enough high school students to know who's interested in becoming a therapist when they grow up, or how popular that field is, or who the field itself is trying to reach out to. Because I know one of the problems that we hear about a lot is not enough therapists of color to talk to people about generational trauma or things that are particular to their communities, So is the National Therapist Board promoting itself effectively, or do you have any sense? Like, is your daughter interested, or does anybody know about?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's it's a booming area right now, which is I'm meeting more and more people are like, I'm enrolled in a psychedelic therapy. Like, I'm learning how to do that. I'm learning what the protocols are. I'm learning now. There's no uniform version of that right now, so that can mean a lot of things. There's unregulated retreats in countries where it's legal. Yeah. And some of those are great. Yeah. And some of those are fucking scary as hell. Yeah. But it's up to the consumer right now to do that work because none of it's. Yeah. And by the way, once it's regulated, like, are we going to trust it? Like, that's by someone else's definition. So you still have to figure it out for yourself. Yeah. I would say though, I am amazed at how many people are finding this as their life work right now. Like, many people, I just keep meeting people who are like, I want to help people with this medicine. Yeah. I have a calling, that are finding this is a calling. So we're right at the beginning of that. Yeah. And, probably, I don't know how many, if there's a coffee shop on every corner in America, I don't know how many corners of every city in this country there's a therapist, but they're probably almost everyone, right? Is like, or there's at least one in every town, if not, if in every city there's 20,000 therapists, that some percentage of those would find this new tool as part of their toolkit to treat some things that take a long time or they don't have answers for, we don't have a lot of answers for addiction or whatever, how do we deal with with heroin and meth and whatever. It's like, oh, there's studies over here that show psychedelics often can help. We haven't quite put those together yet, but it's going to take some time.
Yeah, and my friends who have done well with addiction have definitely benefited from going through the program and having that community continues to be integral.
Yes.
So I just love the idea of continuing to further on the community idea and building smaller communities and maybe even a league of unqualified therapists or something, small communities within communities that can, of people who say, you know what, I'm going to take 5 hours a week to make myself available to this message board or something,
and talk, and just, it's sharing information right now. And there's a lot on the internet, of course. There's so much to read. There's so many books. There's so much you can arm yourself with as you go into this area. And that's what I would say. Like growing up for me, it was just sort of like anything else. It was, you'd walk into a party and then spilled on the table would be like, oh, you can eat a bunch of these pills that someone found in their dad's medicine chest, or there's a sheet of acid, or over here's a bunch of cocaine. It was just like stuff. There was no rule book and I'm like, so I guess you just take everything and see what happens? That's what we're doing? That is not what I would recommend.
Yeah.
I think that, people want to talk about this because it's life-changing for a lot of people. And they'll tell you how and why and how they did it. And try on those different hats.
Before we close out, we have a few more minutes still, but the film is so funny, and the Jerry Stiller, Ben Stiller Pell Mell cigarette moment is like so touching because it's like a lot of times like your experience can differ so intensely from your parents' experience, so you don't have like a reference point. Bless his heart.
Yeah, he's
smoked
trying
a Pell Mell
so
cigarette.
hard.
He was sick for 2 days. He's like, no, that's not where I am. But and then the dude walking through the concert leading with his knees versus leading with his head,
So
like
good.
a little nuance. What were some of the things that were hilarious to you, maybe that didn't make the film or that happened peripherally, or even something that stood out as particularly touching for you from Have a Good Trip?
Oh, interesting. Let's see. I felt like it was very, we talked about Anthony Bourdain and Carrie Fisher, but I do feel like
Bourdain's reenactment is incredible.
yeah, we got those guys were amazing. Everyone was amazing in that. I felt like partly because they passed away that they shared these beautiful stories in time. Carrie Fisher invited us over to her house. We walked around
The Acid House.
The Acid House. I mean, we showed one tiny fraction of the footage we shot there because she's got. I mean, it is a trippy, awesome world that she had created for herself to stay sane up in the Hollywood Hills. And but I did feel some responsibility to share. Here's what they wanted to share. Let's get this out there.
Yeah.
They're gone now. This is amazing. So I was sort of touched that we had the opportunity to visit with them before they were gone. That was kind of amazing. My daughter, we did a lot of stuff on the fly. My daughter is in Steve Agee talking in his trip, and he has we had to cut down so much stuff, but Steve Agee tells this wonderful story about getting dosed at a Grateful Dead show. And we only used him in the paranoia section, so we only used one little part of his story. But he had this thing. He'd never taken acid. He didn't particularly like the Dead. He was a punk rock kid, and he went to this Grateful Dead show and then got dosed. Like someone squirted it in the air, and so he didn't know what was happening. He was like finding that he was like, the Dead is actually kind of cool. Like the music comes out of the speakers, and they have these effects where dragons float around. And his buddy was like, huh? And then his buddy was like, I think you're on acid. And then he panicked. He went into this dark hole and they had to leave, and he got in the car, and he was afraid his friend was trying to kill him. So he was like, I'm not sitting in the front seat with you. I'm sorry, Steve. I'm telling your story.
Is that the little girl with the middle finger?
So then his friend is like, he agrees to get in the car if he sits in the back. So his friend's driving him home going like, my idiot friend's on acid. And he was like, my friend's trying to kill me, and I'm trapped in the back seat. And he's like looking out of the car for anyone who can help him. And he sees this little girl in the car next to him. And so he's like, help me, making eyes at her and going like, help me. And we were like, it's so funny. We have to reenact this. And my daughter was 6 or 7 at the time. I was like, Amity, quick, come on down. We'll just shoot this and put you in the backseat of a car. So Steve's story was basically he found her, he knew she could help, and then she flips him the bird. And he's like, oh my God, the world just caved in. I knew even the little girl was, but it was very touching having her be what we've come to call the glimmer of hope girl, that there's this little girl out there that offers some glimmer of hope in the darkness. So that brought it home to me. Was my daughter has always been the glimmer of hope girl.
My buddy Steve back home is a huge Devo fan, so I want to give him a chance to catch a little bit publicly of what they might have shared, which didn't make the cut too.
Both. So we had a wonderful conversation with Jerry Casale. We had a wonderful conversation with Mark Mothersbaugh. What was so interesting to me is like those guys were in college at Kent State in the late 60s, right? Now, Kent State is this moment where the Nixon administration pushes back essentially against the hippies, going like, we don't want your war. We don't want your, like this jumble of ideas, whether it's environmental or women have rights or little psychedelics. This was all happening at the time. And there's a real pushback, and it actually, rolled in. I was trying to describe this to my 13-year-old today. Actually, I was like, because he loves Devo right now, and it's great. He was like, Dad, what is devolution? And I was like, well, think about evolution. It's the opposite. If we're getting dumber and we're, whatever. So we were having this great conversation. He's like, where did they meet? And I was like, well, at Kent State. And actually, Kent State was this crisis point for us as a civilization, which was half of us decided our military should put down students who were questioning our culture, and psychedelics were a part of that. So anyway, Devo met there, and they started to share this thing, and I was like, oh, it's so cool to think about hippies, essentially, hippie artists, and their response was not to play, psychedelic rock music. Their response was to make a band that was about all of it, but not like, Jimi Hendrix or something. They love Jimi Hendrix, but they were like, well, we can do this different thing. What if we make a philosophy about where society seems to be heading, which is backwards. Like we stopped evolving, and now we've actually not just stopped evolving, we're actually heading the other direction. So awesome. Anyway, they shared amazing stories. I would love to. Jerry Casale turned into a bug on the floor at this woman's house, which we'll have to share. We're working on a second movie right now. We got to get in there. And then Mark's story is, he's like a bumpkin from Ohio, and he goes to New York for the first time, and somehow their first album had come out maybe. So he got invited out with Andy Warhol and Michael Jackson and goes to Studio 54. And he's just like, gee, golly, who are these? Where am I? Whatever. And somehow a joint is passed around that goes through Michael Jackson. So he's like, well, if Michael Jackson's saying anything to me, now I don't know if Michael smoked it, whatever, but he smoked this joint, and then things got very psychedelic for him. It was probably PCP, which was also like, is this, well, he's seeing things, but basically the Studio 54 became a horror show for him, which was as only he can describe. But we'll get those out there at some point. So
more stories are forthcoming.
More stories are forthcoming, always.
Donick, thanks for taking the time to come and get wet and soppy and light and funny and cover all the territory.
I was imagining that in your video version of this, that there's like a graphic that whenever you're like, I've got a wet blanket, that there's a wet blanket. Like there's some great graphic that just stops everything.
Can I bring you on as an animation consultant?
Yes, of course.
I can't doodle it myself, so I need some skilled hands.
I love it. Time for the wet blanket. A big soppy sound. Anyway, thank you so much. That was great.
Thanks, Donick.